In our last lecture, we initiated the discussion on liberal perspective on state. In this lecture, we continue our discussion, and this continuation is necessary for the reason that although we have seen what liberalism means, that is, liberalism as an ideology means, what the liberal understanding of the state means, we also have to keep in mind that broadly speaking, although liberalism primarily tries to argue that it is opposed to state, it is opposed to state interference, it is opposed to state intervention, and it stands for the autonomy of the individual, this very idea, this very spirit of liberalism, well, it has been manifest in primarily two forms. One is neoliberalism, which we have already discussed in our last lecture. The other is pluralism. In this particular lecture, we will focus on the pluralist variation or the pluralist variety of liberalism. How the pluralist view of the state is or has made a major contribution to the development of liberal perspective on state. Now, first of all, we have to understand that what pluralism stands for. Pluralism is a doctrine which, in a way, largely tries to argue that the individual has no meaning. Individual has virtually no identity without his membership of any group or association. That is, it is only through group, it is only through membership of association that the individual realizes his own self. This is the gist or essence of pluralism. And we will see that neoliberalism and pluralism, well, both of them in a way subscribe to the basic doctrine, to the basic spirit of liberalism, which tries to argue that state interference, the state intervention, in principle is wrong, and that it is the defense of individual freedom, it is the preservation of the autonomy of the individual that is most sacred in the doctrine of liberalism. Now, neoliberalism has addressed this question on one level in a particular way. Pluralism addresses the question on another level in a different way. Now, let us first of all, once we have understood that what is the meaning of pluralism, let us first of all try to understand how pluralism originated. Pluralism, broadly speaking, in the field of political science, has got two varieties, or one can say two different models. One, pluralism as it developed in England, the other pluralism as it developed in the United States. Although, interestingly, initially, when pluralism originated in England and United States, they almost were identical. But eventually what happened was, and that is also a very interesting story, that how and why pluralism declined in Britain and pluralism primarily consolidated itself, pluralism assumed different forms, pluralism underwent a number of interesting transformations, and all these things happened primarily in the United States. That itself is an interesting story because one has to explain that why pluralism declined in Britain, why pluralism could not sustain itself in Britain, and why is it that pluralism flourished in the United States in a very big way. Now, let us first of all try to understand how and why pluralism originated in Britain and United States. Basically, the explanation is something like this, that in Britain and United States, it was felt that individuals, well, they can feel secure. The individual feels that it is possible for him or her to attain self-fulfillment. It is possible for the individual to find out a meaning in his or her life only by being a member of numerous social groups, voluntary associations, popularly called civil society. So only by being a member of these groups, associations, civil societies, etc., it is possible for the individual to realize the true sense of freedom. And in Britain as well as United States, in Britain for instance, it is a fact that there was a tradition of, say, this kind of understanding of the relation between individual and groups, in the sense that in Britain it was felt, at least up to the time of the First World War, that a number of services which are necessary in the life of the individual would be delivered through these voluntary associations and organizations. And as a result, till the time of the First World War, pluralism flourished in a big way in Britain. But after the end of the First World War, and especially since the beginning of the 1920s, pluralism gradually began to decline in Britain. The explanation, very briefly speaking, is something like this. In Britain, broadly speaking, there was always a statist tradition, that is a focus on the state. It was believed for a long time, and that has been a part of English history, that the state occupies a major role, the state plays a major role in the life of society. That is, yes, voluntary associations, social groups, these are important, but not without reference to the state. That is, these groups, these associations, they of course will play their role, but only by having a negotiation with the state. That is, they are not above the state. They have to be always aware of the fact that it is because the state is there that they also exist and they are able to play a role in English society. So all along, these voluntary groups, associations, these pluralist forms of organizations, well, they were quite active in Britain, but they never operated outside the periphery of the state. That is, the presence of the state was always there in England. And as a result, what happened was, especially after the end of the Second World War, when a welfare state emerged in Britain, primarily under the auspices of the Labour Party, what happened was that these societies, they were there all right, but the state increasingly came to play a very big role in England. In fact, many of the activities which earlier were discharged by these voluntary groups, associations, well, these activities were eventually taken over by the British state. And they reached a climax, actually. They reached a height, especially during that period of Margaret Thatcher, when she came to power in the 1980s in Britain. In United States, however, it's a different story. In United States, the state never played, like Britain, a very crucial, major role in the life of the American people. And what is meant by this fact is that in United States, there was no such legacy of welfarism which we come across in England. In United States, all the time it was felt that these voluntary groups, associations, organizations, well, they constitute the heart of American life. That is, in United States, individuals have no meaning without their association, without their membership of these numerous groups, lobbies, interest groups, pressure groups, multifarious organizations, etc. So, without membership of these associations, organizations, the life of an American in American society is meaningless. So the crucial difference between Britain and United States is that in United States, objectively, the ground for development of pluralism, well, it was much more fertile than the kind of situation which operated in England. Now, in United States, however, what we come across is a very interesting phenomena in relation to the development of this pluralist doctrine. This is something quite unique which we come across in United States. This is something which we do not come across in Britain. What happened in United States was that there were two quite distinct stages insofar as development of pluralism or the development of the pluralist notion of state is concerned. Initially, when pluralism took off in the United States, when it was argued, when it was believed that yes, it is the groups which play a very crucial role, a very active role in American society, at that time it was considered to be a normative principle. It's a kind of moral principle. It was something which one has to go by. It is something which became a principle of American life. So this was a kind of normative principle which guided the American society. But what happened later, and that was the second phase of American pluralism, what happened later was, and this is very, very interesting, that this normative principle became a kind of explanation of the reality of American politics. That is, what actually happened was this normative principle was transformed into an empirical explanation of how the American state works, how the American state operates, how the American state functions. Now, how it was done? To understand how it was done, we have to just quickly look at some of the names, some of the very important figures in American, in the kind of pluralism which flourished in the United States. Just as in Britain, we come across some very important names like Figgis, like Harold Lasky. Similarly, in American system, or rather in American society, we come across certain very important, certain very big names, and they are key figures in American political science. For instance, one is Arthur Bentley, then David Truman. Well, all of them, and later Robert Dahl. Well, these are figures who were the key personalities in the development of pluralism in the United States. Now, as I was arguing, in United States, how this transformation took place, that is, transformation of a normative principle into a kind of empirical explanation of American political system. To understand how it happened, one has to look into three principles. The first principle was that groups play a crucial role in American politics in the formulation of public policies. That is, policies initiated by the government, policies worked out by the government, these are to be explained, or say they are made effective primarily through the negotiation between the government and these different groups and lobbies. This is the first principle. The second principle, Robert Dahl, for instance, was a very major exponent of this particular proposition. That is, the focus is on how power is distributed throughout the system in American society. In other words, this is a principle which tries to suggest that in America, statism, concentration of power in the hands of the state, well, it has never been an established phenomenon. That is, you can never locate the centrality of power in the American system. Power is diffused, power is dispersed, power is fragmented throughout the American society. And it is represented by, it is embodied in, say, numerous groups and organizations, pressure groups, interest groups, etc. So you can never visibly locate the centrality of power in the American system. That is, pluralism is embedded in the American system. So this is the second principle. The third principle is that because of this continuous, constant negotiation between, say, the government, the pressure groups, the interest groups, different lobbies, because of the way public policies are arrived at through this kind of interaction. So there is a kind of underlying consensus in American society. That is, the values on the basis of which the government functions, the values which go into the making of the policies of the American state, well, these values are shared by the entire American system. That is, there is a sort of underlying consensus which explains the resilience of, which explains the stability of the American system. In other words, there is a consensus, there is a broad acceptance, there is a large-scale endorsement of what is happening in United States. That is, the American political system thereby is based on a consensus model. And conflict, of course conflict is there, but conflict has always been overshadowed by consensus, and that explains the stability of the American system. This is how pluralism or the pluralist doctrine or the pluralist variant of liberalism, well, this became the explanatory factor while understanding the stability of American political system. Now, so far so good. But the interesting thing is that this pluralist explanation of American's political system, however, very soon was faced with challenges. And these challenges began to be visible. These challenges could no longer be ignored. When in the 1960s and then throughout the 1970s, American society and American state, well, these were rocked by a series of disturbing events. Civil rights movement, assassination of Martin Luther King, widespread campus violence, protests and demonstrations against Vietnam War, against American involvement in Vietnam War. Well, all these things very largely raised certain uncomfortable questions. The uncomfortable questions were that was there, truly speaking, a consensus? That is it that all Americans shared certain values on the basis of which the American state tried to justify itself, on the basis of which the American state tried to justify its war in Vietnam? So, when these questions began to be raised, a new kind of understanding in regard to pluralism gradually began to develop in the United States. Charles Lindblom, for instance, a leading pluralist, formulated a new understanding of pluralism. That is, earlier it was believed that the American society was to be explained in terms of the activities of different groups. Now it was argued that groups, of course, were very important. Groups, of course, their role in American society could not be ignored. But ultimately, in practice, operationally, what happened in the United States, or rather what was happening in the United States, was that these groups, these associations, these organizations, notwithstanding their crucial role in the American political system, they were ultimately, in the long run, dominated by certain powerful business groups. So it is the business lobby which had the ultimate say, which ultimately controlled the American political system. So, pluralism continued, but it was a new kind of pluralism, a kind of modification of pluralism, which now began to surface in American political science. That is the old traditional pluralism, that is pluralism which simply tries to argue that there are groups in society, and all these groups they are almost evenly placed, and thereby the groups play a crucial role in the explanation of social and political life. This interpretation, this understanding was revised, and a new kind of version of pluralism emerged in United States, which tried to argue that yes, groups are important, but ultimately it is the business groups, the dominant economic groups, who eventually control the American social and political life. Now, following this discussion, we have to now look at some of the recent developments in the field of pluralist understanding of the modern liberal state. I will identify very briefly 3 such variations. The first is called governance, a new term, a new expression which has of late become very, very popular. Governance tries to argue that when the government is now framing policies and programs, in the framing of policies and programs, in the implementation, execution of policies and programs, it is not the government which ultimately has the final say. In fact, the government is unable, the government is simply incapable of indulging in this kind of activity. Now, for formulation of policies and programs, for implementation, execution of many of these policies and programs, the government has to interact with a number of private organizations, a number of, say, groups, associations. That is, the government has to be engaged in a dialogue with different types of, different kinds of non-governmental organizations, groups and associations. And this is known as the science of governance. That is, government has to learn, the government has to master the technique of how to manage a society, how to manage a state, how to manage the administration. And these managerial techniques, the government has to learn from non-governmental sectors. This is one. Number 2, that is a second kind of development. That is a kind of variety of pluralism which is associated with civil society and social capital. This notion of civil society is of course known to all of us, but what about social capital? One American scholar, Robert Putnam, he, on the basis of field visit in Italy, came to the conclusion, and after publication of Putnam's book, it has become a very important contribution to this new kind of pluralist understanding of state. Now, Putnam's thesis is, and in fact social capital is an expression picked up by him, if in a particular region development does not take place, if the people remain underdeveloped, the explanation is not that objectively that particular region is backward. The people are unable to get benefits of development in that particular region for the simple reasons that they have not been able to organize themselves into a proper civil society kind of association, and they have not been able to mobilize the resources which they should have done. That is, it is because of the inability of the local people to organize the resources, which he calls social capital, that is possible only through their membership of, through their organization in the form of certain associations or groups. That is why these people are backward. This is the thesis of Robert Putnam. So the people have to mobilize themselves into social groups, associations, organizations. They have to mobilize the local resources. Only then it is possible for them to develop that region. Thirdly, a new notion has emerged that is known as multiculturalism. Multiculturalism means you have to recognize multiple identities. Multiple identities, you have to recognize the identities of numerous groups in society. That is in modern society, you cannot have any monoculture. You cannot have one state representing one particular kind of culture. You have to respect the rights, the interests, the demands of different groups and particularly the minorities. So this then is the track record of this pluralist understanding of state. You can very well understand that pluralism, like the other variety of liberalism, well, it has undergone many transformations. It initially developed through two variations, one British, the other is American. The British variation or the British model declined, the American model triumphed, and with that I close my lecture. Thank you.